Welcome to the Personality Politics podcast, the podcast where we get to know the people behind the politicians. In every episode, we leave the policy debates and party politics at the door to explore the personal stories that have shaped the people who represent us. Our guest today is Stuart Andrew MP. He served in a number of ministerial roles throughout his career and is currently the Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. I'm Tom Lane, and this is Personality Politics. Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Personality Politics podcast. I was delighted to say our guest is the Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Stuart Andrew. Stuart, thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome. No, pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to start off with quite a difficult question on this podcast. I believe that you were born in a village with a very long and difficult to pronounce name, and I would like to test out how good the person doing the captions on some of our videos are. So I wondered if you could possibly say that for me.
Yes, of course. So the first few years of my life was spent in Llanfair, Pwllgwyngyll, Gogerach, Windrobwll, Llantysilio, Gogogoch.
Is that something that you had to write down when you were in school?
Well, to be honest with you, in the primary school I went to, it was right along the side of the building in both, the sort of full Welsh spelling of it, but also the phonetic pronunciation of it, so that it gave people the opportunity to learn it who visited the village.
Fantastic. I mean, that's a sort of an interesting place to start on this podcast. Mainly is getting to know the people rather than talking about policy, which hopefully makes a nice change. I wonder what life was like growing up in Wales. I believe you grew up on a council estate. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. I grew up, we lived in Llanfair PG to start with. I won't say the full name all over again. And then we moved to this council estate in Llanfair, which is a sort of village, a place outside of Beaumaris. And I mean, I often talk about the fact that, within my family, there wasn't a great deal of money. Certainly, there were times when dad was unemployed for quite a long time. But what there was on the estate was sort of bags of community spirit and, what we sort of all lacked in, wealth and money actually was made up in bags of community spirit and looking after each other and trying to do the best for the estate and improving our lives, really.
What was your sort of, I guess, family life like as you were growing up?
So I'm the eldest of four boys. And yeah, so eventually when my dad did get some work, he was spent quite a lot of time working away. He worked on the Channel Tunnel, worked in Germany as a welder. And so, a lot of the responsibility, I suppose, for bringing up four boys fell to my mum, really. And she did, in my view, a pretty spectacular job. I don't imagine that we were always the easiest to sort of bring up, but she certainly sort of instilled in me some of the values that I still hold dear today, really.
Growing up with, you say, three brothers, what was that like? Was it quite a boisterous household?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, considering we all come from the same family, we're all very different. There is, it is very strange actually how we have very different characters, very different interests, very different characteristics, and so on. Yeah, I mean, it was boisterous, of course, it would be at times, but equally, I like to think that we sort of looked out for each other when we really needed to, really.
And talking more, I guess, about your school life, what were you like at school as a child? Were you one of the popular ones? Were you a bit of a geek? What was your role in school?
Well, I'd say I think I was probably in the middle. I've never been particularly academic, if I'm being really honest. There were too many times when I was in lessons where I was probably staring out the window more than I should have been. But but I do absorb things from people. I absorb information from people, and that's where I get most of my learning from. I just found the sort of, head in a textbook type thing not particularly engaging for me. It's just the way I'm made, if you like. But, I had a good circle of friends there. I went to a little primary school in a village called Llangoed. There were only about 96 of us in this whole school. And then secondary school was David Hughes School in Bridge, where, funnily enough, I mean, people like Ala Jones, the singer, went to school. And so did Rhyn ap Iorwerth, who is now the leader of the Welsh government from Plaid Cymru. We were in the same year together. So there's obviously something in that school that wasn't too bad.
You say you went to the same school as the Welsh Government leader at the moment. Did you ever cross paths?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Rin and I, I've, throughout my time in politics, because I started my career my political work in Wales. Rin at the time, when he left school and university, went to work for the BBC as a political reporter. So he often would interview me as a Conservative on various issues, and then he then stood for the Welsh Assembly for Anglesey and was successful for Plaid Cymru. And now he is the First Minister of Wales. So, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I know Rhin well. We obviously have different politics, but actually, on a personal level, I like to think that we get on well because, we've seen each other grow up over the years.
You talked about your time at school there. I wondered, you're now obviously the MP for Daventry. Is that something, did you aspire to work in politics? Did you have like a dream first job when you were younger? What was your sort of view growing up?
So I remember when I was 14 having a chat with my mum in the kitchen and saying, one day I'd like to be an MP. And I remember the look on her face was slightly perplexed. I don't think she'd ever expected me to sort of mention that. But I just suddenly developed this real interest in politics. And I think having seen a councillor working hard on our estate and sort of bringing the community together to do things for ourselves
Mhm.
sort of inspired me really. And I found that really interesting and I found it rewarding being part of that community work. But then equally, I really enjoyed politics itself and I was fascinated by current affairs, and those were the things that sort of motivated me to get involved. And so, I said I'd want to be one, but the reality in my mind, probably, given the fact that I never did particularly brilliantly at school. I didn't go to university. I thought, well, the prospect of ever becoming a member of parliament was probably never really going to happen. So, yeah, I'm pretty chuffed that I managed to do it in the end. Yeah, it's been good.
You mentioned your mom was slightly perplexed when you said that you wanted to be an MP when you were older. I wonder if was politics something that was discussed at home, or was that something that was avoided?
It was never discussed. So my parents both always voted, but never ever talked about who they voted for. They kept that very private to themselves. Of course, mum and dad would make some comments about stuff that was happening on the telly every now and again, but it was never a particularly political household. And in fact, years later, uh, as I sort of deepened my interest in politics and got more and more involved and, became a councillor and then eventually MP, the family were trying to work out, where does this interest in politics come from? And eventually, I think it was my auntie who was doing a bit of work on the sort of family tree and discovered that I think it was my great great grandfather was best friends with Keir Hardie and helped him set up the Labour Party and was a big trade unionist up in Scotland. So that's an interesting. He probably was just spinning in his grave now, but clearly that's where my politics interest in politics must have come from.
That's so interesting. I wonder if you talked about your sort of younger days. Now, I wonder if there's anything from your days when you were younger that sort of stuck with you and maybe influenced the way that you are now.
So I think it was genuinely seeing how opportunities were suddenly given for people on the estate that hadn't been there before. So, for example, the opportunity to become a homeowner, buying your council estate, council house. That was something that was never, ever even a distant dream for many of the people living on our estate. It just was, home ownership was never going to be something they would ever do. And suddenly there came this chance to be able to do so. And that did something quite phenomenal for those people, actually. They suddenly, you could tell, I always used to say, you could always tell when somebody had bought their house because the first thing they'd do is change the front door so that it looked different to everybody else's, which is great. It's pride in their place. And that helped then sort of raise standards on the estate. Equally, there was a government scheme to encourage people who were unemployed to set up their own small business, which Dad did, and that sort of changed our sort of income levels, if you like, and our standard of living. And so it just occurred to me that those opportunities were brought about by giving people the tools they needed to do things for themselves. And that's what has really stuck with me. That actually, if you do it that way, encourage people to where they can to be able to improve their own lives, then they will do so much better than any government can do it. I think it's much better to enable people rather than just hand out money to them, if you like.
You've sort of done a number of jobs before getting into politics, looking at the sort of charity sector, and I wondered what sort of drawn you to work in that sector, and maybe what was your first job?
So I started doing fundraising when I was at school, actually, because one of our my best friend, his older brother, sadly died of a brain hemorrhage, and when you're, I think we must have been about 11 or 12 at the time when that happened. That I think that was one of my first proper experiences of death, really. Sudden, and it was shocking because it was someone so young, and there was an air of sense of, if you like, a bit of helplessness. What on earth do we do as teenagers? So we decided, a gang of us, to raise money in his memory, and that sort of got me interested in sort of charity work. And then a few years later, I someone knew that I was I did a lot of charity work, and they were the director for the British Heart Foundation in Wales, and invited me to apply for a position, which I then took. I then actually spent most of my working career in hospices. My final job was as head of fundraising for a children's hospice in Yorkshire, and I found that experience phenomenal. Really, you see you see families trying to cope with some of the most challenging and difficult things that any family would face. No parent wants to outlive their child, and no parent wants to see their child suffer. But, seeing that there were these places like the Children's Hospice, Martin House, that I used to work at, offering that care and support to the family was just, really uh, heartwarming, and really motivated me every day to go out there and raise the money we needed to run that service. And yeah, that experience has stuck with me for many. Well, it will stick with me forever, really.
You've spoken there about some of the jobs that you've done, and we spoke obviously earlier about you mentioning to your mum that you were looking to become an MP at some point in the future. When did that start to become something that actually could be something that would happen?
So I did actually stand in the 1997 general election in Wrexham. I was very young at the time. Mm, Obviously, that was a terrible election for us as a party. We didn't do very well. And then I sort of took a bit of a break because I had a bit of a disagreement, if you like, with the party. But roll on a few years, and I then moved over to Leeds, uh, and in 2003, I was chosen to stand for the council, for Leeds City Council, and was fortunate enough to get elected to the council. And then in 2006, the party was looking for a parliamentary candidate for the Pudsey constituency, and so I decided to put my name forward, and I was fortunate enough to get selected. And then in 2010, what was a Labour seat, I managed to take in the 2010 general election, and yeah, I mean, I couldn't quite believe that it had happened, really. Suddenly that conversation when I was 14 suddenly became a reality, and it dawned on me the enormity of what now lay ahead.
Sort of going back to some of the jobs you did before getting into politics, what did working with the sort of hospice groups and in the charity sector teach you that maybe is stuck with you, or lessons that you've learned?
So I think certainly the families that meeting them was humbling. I mean, they, as I say, they were going through something that is quite unimaginable, but they did so with just such resilience. It was unbelievable. And I remember one conversation with a father, and he said to me, if I get up, 8 times in the night to his daughter, he considered that that was a good night's sleep. And I just thought, my goodness, that must be exhausting. And that really stuck with me. And also how having a child with, a life limiting illness affects a family in so many different ways. One mother described it as you change your hopes and dreams because, when she was pregnant, she would think about the baby's first day, the baby's, first day at primary school, and then the child's going on to secondary school and university, and then, job and marriage and all of that. Then suddenly the child gets diagnosed with whatever condition it may be. And all of that planned journey that she had for her child just changed completely. And that adjustment was something that was quite major for families to have to deal with. So that struck me. It struck me that, for many families, there would be an intense pressure on the relationship because obviously this is such a hard thing to deal with. And then on top of that, one would have to probably give up work because they had to provide that care. So again, financial difficulties. And then if they had other children, the experiences that the siblings had would be very different to the experiences that their classmates may have, so going, at the weekend to the seaside or whatever, it's just not possible because it would it's a major operation because they have all so much equipment, wheelchairs, all everything that are needed to take them. So it just struck me that, there's so much that happens to those families, and thank God that in this country we have such a brilliant sort of charity network, out there that do help support. So, I mean, obviously we have the statutory services and they're absolutely brilliant in doing what they do. But in terms of complementing that and offering help and support, I just think we're so blessed in this country that we have those charities, and really lucky that the British people put their hands in their pockets for these charities. We are blessed, I think, that we have that sort of that culture of giving for others and supporting others. I think it's superb.
Is it hard working in that sort of sector? Obviously, I guess you get the sense of duty almost when working in those sectors, but it must be quite difficult to hear some of them stories on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is yes. And, there were occasions when I would drive home from work in floods of tears because either a child had died or I listened to a particular family's challenges and that just stayed with me. Yeah, I mean, it was really, there were times when it was really difficult and really hard. But equally, there were times when it made me realize that I had to keep, I had to do my bit so that the care staff could do their bit, and how important it was to keep it going. There's a wonderful saying with the children's hospice movement. They say, whilst we can't add days to their life, we can add life to their days. And I think that's what was so superb about it. It was about really celebrating that child's life, making sure that the family got all the amazing memories they need to and experiences. So, whilst it was difficult, of course it was also incredibly rewarding. It was a privilege to share those families' lives, really.
Having worked in the charity sector, I believe you worked as a councillor and now as an MP as well. Is dealing with people something that you're quite enthusiastic about? Do you like to have like a sort of public facing role?
Yeah, I think that's what I was born to do, if I'm honest. I mean, that sounds a bit a bit sort of over the top, I suppose. But I get a lot of personal satisfaction of being able to help people and engaging with people and working with them. I thrive off that. I find my job incredibly interesting because no 2 days are the same. You get to meet a variety of people who are either trying to do some phenomenal work in the area that they live, or are campaigning on issues that matter to them, or, doing community work that makes our areas a better place. I love that. Yeah. And I try to be approachable. I like to think that people can come and have a chat with me feeling quite relaxed. And, I like to think that I can put people at their ease relatively quickly.
You mentioned earlier running in the 97 election, which obviously didn't go super well for yourself or the party at the time. What was that experience like running for an election that doesn't go your way?
So, I mean, actually, I think it was probably, there was a part of you knew this wasn't going to go well. The polls were pretty clear. We had a Labour leader in Tony Blair who was, very charismatic. Our party had been in for 18 years. It's been subject to some challenging times, and people had got tired of us. So, but I suppose, regardless, it just it proved to me that it was important that people still had a choice, because there were people out there who did still want to vote for us, and it was therefore incumbent on me and my team to get out there to talk to people and say that we're here. We want your support. So, whilst it was a challenging experience at times, it was also quite rewarding because, people were on the whole okay. I think when your party's in trouble because people almost give you a look of pity rather than anger. And, that's how it was. But it's certainly, I think everything in life is an opportunity to be an experience, to learn, and that was certainly one of them.
We've obviously just had quite a major by-election in the UK, not asking
Mhm.
specifically about that, but I wondered if you've had any interesting experiences while knocking on doors, become an MP or being an MP.
Yeah, I could spend all day telling you some of the stories that happen. I mean, it is elections are funny things, and sometimes you get people answering the door really suspicious because they think you might be Jehovah's Witness, and then actually sometimes they either look disappointed or relieved when they find out that you're not. But equally, there are times, I remember in one general election, an 84-year-old lady had asked if we could pick her up, take her to the polling station so she could vote. And I went to the door, knocked on the door, and she answered and she said, "Just give me 2 minutes. I'll just go and get my dad." And this 104-year-old man came walking to the door and wanted to go and vote in person. And that I thought was amazing. Bless him. It took us a bit of time to get him to the polling station, but he did his duty. And I just, that was really, heartwarming, I have to say.
Do you know if he, well, I guess you don't know if he voted your way or not.
I hope so, because we took him. Although I do remember, I haven't talked about this, where there was another election where three ladies who lived in three separate bungalows in a older people's area. It took me about half an hour to get each of them into the car and then drive them to the polling station. Into the polling station, they went to vote. And when I was driving them back, they were talking about how wonderful the Labour candidate was. So I clearly delivered Labour's three votes that day. So yeah, you win some, you lose some, as it were.
Well, we spoke about that. That's, I guess, that sort of running for election, losing in the '97 election. What was it like when you get selected in, you said 2006, and you win in 2010? What's that feeling when you become an MP?
So I think it's important to remember the run up to it first. So, 4 years is a long time to be a candidate, because you still have to do your job, because I don't have personal wealth. I had to have earn a crust, as it were. But at the same time, you're almost doing another full time job being the candidate, because you've constantly got to be canvassing, delivering literature, building up information about how people think they might vote. And sustaining that for 4 years was hard going, I have to say. But, that's the job you sort of signed up for, really. And so doing it on the night itself, I remember the Labour candidate coming up to me and saying he thought he'd beaten me by 300 votes. And I remember thinking, 300 votes, I could almost, if I'd have just kept working for another, hour or so, I might have got, my team and I might have got that. As it happens, what he hadn't seen is that the postal ballot box hadn't been opened, and we won the postal vote. And so I took the seat with a 1600 majority. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. I remember going up on the stage. I remember the whole of my team, were absolutely, over the moon. The cheers when it was announced was phenomenal. And my mum was there at the count, and, she clearly was, she was very, very proud, very happy. And so that conversation when I was 14 suddenly became a reality for both of us.
Fantastic. I wondered, obviously, that was 2010 election, and there was a lot of discussion about who would go into government
Mm.
as a party following that election. I wondered how you found, well, I guess you've just been elected as an MP for the first time. You sort of don't know whether your party is going to be in government or
Mm.
opposition.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And also, it all happened so quick because, I was still working in the hospice. And then suddenly, the early hours of Friday morning, I've won an election. I'm suddenly a member of parliament. And then I'm told that I need to get down to London on the Monday. So I had to resign my job. I had to find accommodation. I had to get to London. Uh, it was like a whirlwind. And like you say, at the same time, we had no idea who was going to form the government because there was no party with overall control. And we were certainly aware of, intense conversations that were clearly going on between the parties. But, even though I was sort of there in Westminster, we were as oblivious as everybody else as to what was actually going on. We were just getting our information from the news. And when we got to Parliament, they sort of do a sort of induction and show you round and all of that. And you're trying to absorb all that. And at the same time, trying to work out, well, which side of the House of Commons will be sitting on. We didn't know. But it was a few days later that we were all summoned to a meeting in one of the committee rooms, and David Cameron, George Osborne, and the Chief Whip Patrick McLaughlin put to the parliamentary party the recommendation that we go into coalition with the Lib Dems. And so there was a bit of a conversation that happened, and the rest is history, as we say.
Was there anything when you first got elected that surprised you or shocked you becoming an MP?
Do you know what? It was like going to school for the first day, your first day at school. Because we went into Portcullis House, you're given your pass, and then you're sort of sent to various rooms to pick up a laptop, pick up a phone, and then they take you around Parliament, and they take you into a cloakroom, believe it or not, that has your name on the peg. It is literally like, a school. And then I think really the thing that really surprised me was the first moment I walked into the chamber, and that's when it hit me that, oh my God, this is where I now work. I've seen this chamber so many times on the television. It's been a part of something that I've been interested in for years. And now it's an integral part of my life. And then the shock of how small the chamber actually is in reality. It looks huge on the television, but then you get in there and it is quite small. And actually, it's interesting when I take people around, that's the first thing they all say is how small it feels.
You've obviously been in the party of government and you've been in the party of opposition now. I wonder what you find the differences between those two things.
Well, when you're in government, I mean, and I think this government are certainly finding this at the moment, is, it's not easy. It's not easy governing, and you have to make difficult decisions, and you have to make decisions that are not going to be popular with some of your constituents. And, that is hard. It is, but that's the reality of politics. What I would say is that when you're in government, you have you have the full support, if you like, of the civil service behind you. So, that sort of expertise and knowledge and briefings and so on. Go into opposition and you're pretty much on your own. And you have to do it on your own. So it's from that perspective, it's easier in government. But as I say, you are then the ones that get all the emails asking you to vote certain ways, and that can be a challenge. In opposition, though, it is frustrating because you're not able to do the things that you would like to do. You don't, someone else has that power. And all you can do is hold the government to account and question and campaign and lobby on behalf of your constituents. And sometimes that's how, doesn't achieve the results you would like.
Since becoming an MP in 2010, I wonder what you count as your sort of biggest moments of pride and maybe if you have any regrets as well.
So I think one of the big campaigns I started when I first got elected was I went to do a visit, or I was invited to go and visit the hospital in Leeds. And they wanted to make me aware of the fact that there was a plan to close the children's heart unit there. And because of my background in the hospice movement, I knew that actually closing that would mean that the nearest places that would be able to deal with children's heart disease would then either be in Newcastle or in Birmingham, both of which are a very long way from, sort of the middle of Yorkshire. And so I decided we needed to do something about this. And I sort of coordinated a cross party campaign from across Yorkshire. And, for me, that showed politics working at its best because all of us from different political parties were doing our bit to try and save the service there. It took a long time. I think we've fought that campaign for nearly a year, if not more, but eventually we were successful. And I'm pleased to say now that unit is amongst one of the best in the country. So that was really good. And I think the second thing was being a part of the debate and speaking in the debate and voting for equal marriage. That was a seismic moment, really, and one which I feel very proud to have been a part of.
On the flip side, do you have anything that maybe you regret or things that you thought, "I wish I'd done that instead"?
Oh, I mean, there are times when you perhaps wish you hadn't voted a certain way. And I think there are times when you are so divided in your own mind. People think it's easy making a decision. It isn't. I'm a human being. I hear the good and the bad, and the pros and the cons of each argument. And sometimes you feel like you're in a dilemma, and sometimes you feel like maybe I should have voted differently. But you have to make a decision. That's what we're elected to do, and you have to stick by it and stand by it. But yeah, I think that's the excuse me. I think that's sometimes the hardest bit of the job.
I don't like to talk too much about Westminster. I guess that's not really the point of this podcast. But one thing I always like to ask is how you work collaboratively with people from across the divide, various different parties. Do you have friends from different parties? Is there particular projects that you've worked on with MPs from across the aisle or to the sides, I guess?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things. This is the misconception that many people have about Parliament. They see probably most people's experience of what Parliament is like, if they ever watch any of it, is Prime Minister's questions. And I often describe that as, pretty much the pantomime of the week. It is the moment to sort of try and score political points against the Prime Minister. And, that's that moment. But what people don't see is that cross party working, and there's a hell of a lot of that happens. And there are some really good friendships that sort of build across, the political divide. And yes, I mean, I mentioned the Children's Heart Unit. People like Hilary Benn were a part of that campaign. And obviously our politics are very different, but I was absolutely grateful to him because he brought a wealth of experience in parliamentary procedures and helped me to sort of navigate that and often took part in those himself, of course. But so that was really good. But yeah, I mean, there are quite a lot of colleagues from across the chamber and to the side of the chamber that I get on extremely well with.
You've obviously had a number of roles within the Conservative Party. I wonder, and you're I guess, quite a public figure. I wonder if there's a difference between yourself, who goes and does interviews on the TV or talks in the House of Commons, and the Stuart Andrew that sits at home and maybe watches something on Netflix.
I'd like to think not. I'd like to think the two are the same. I suppose one you have to, you know, you, I suppose what you're not doing sometimes when you are perhaps giving a debate or a challenging debate you're taking part in, or if you're doing an interview is sometimes not showing your inner feeling. And, I sometimes get incredibly nervous before doing interviews or going on a program or speaking in the House of Commons. And I try not to show that, but sometimes I do get incredibly nervous. I'm my own worst critic, by the way. I think I will pull myself to pieces afterwards if I think I didn't do a good job. And a lot of people will say to me, "You're just being way too harsh on yourself." But that's who I am. And I remember talking, I think it was David Davis I was talking to, and he said, "You know what? The moment you go into that chamber and you're not nervous is the day you should give up because it means you don't care enough." I thought those were wise words, really.
Talking of life outside of Westminster, what do you do in any sort of spare time that you may have?
So I mean, there's a couple of things. I like to go to the gym and do some swimming. But equally, one of my favorite things is actually baking. I find baking really interesting. I like to experiment with, different recipes, different challenges. Some are more successful than others, but I think I've been renowned in Westminster and in government departments that I've worked in the past. I used to take the baking that I created over the weekend down for others to enjoy, and so it's a good way of winning friends over through their stomachs.
Has that helped you make friends and influence people
It
through
really did,
games?
absolutely. And in fact, actually, if I'd had a really busy weekend where I hadn't been able to make any, the look of disappointment on their faces when I came empty-handed was quite telling sometimes.
Uh, on a sort of personal level, how would sort of people in your life outside of Parliament, maybe friends, describe you as a person?
Gosh, that's quite hard to say, isn't it? Because it's sort of me. I think I would like to think that they would say that I am approachable, considerate, and kind, and that I listen. I'm sort of and yeah, be a loyal friend, really. But also sometimes, someone who is sort of self-deprecating can be quite critical of myself and will sometimes talk myself down, but so I think a combination of all of that is probably what they would say.
Oh,
I hope they'd think I'm good fun to be with as well, though.
obviously, it's quite a stressful job being an MP. I wonder what you do to unwind after that when you come home.
Do you know what? If I'm going to be really honest, I love going to the pub. I just love, meeting people from the village, meeting up with friends, having for me, being with people is the thing that I thrive off the most, and being with those that are close to me, my friends, my partner, my family members, that's what helps me sort of unwind really. And sometimes, just having the opportunity to sit down and watch a film, just having a bit of time to yourself is great because it is a full on job. You are, pretty much working 7 days a week. And so having those opportunities to have a bit of a relax is, you guard them especially well.
Obviously, you mentioned going to the pub. Pubs are currently full of excited football fans. Someone that grew up in Wales, maybe you have got English and Scottish connections that you're going to answer me with, but someone that grew up in Wales, can you support England and Scotland?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm a unionist, so I believe in Great Britain, and if any of our nations are in it, then I'm right behind them. If Wales were in there, I'd be backing them first, but obviously I will support England and Scotland. As it happens, my mum is English and my dad is Scottish, so I think I can legitimately support them all. And I just think it's a brilliant way of bringing the country together. I really want both Scotland and Scotland and England to do really, really well because it does lift the nation, and we'll see how it goes.
You've obviously come out as part of the LGBT community. I wondered, it is obviously Pride Month as well.
Mm.
Do you think things like that are still important? What do you think is the importance of them at this sort of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are important. I mean, I think, we have come an incredibly long way. I mean, if I think about my lifetime, things we've gone from I was born in 71. I think that was the first year, or the following year was the first Pride March in London, which I'm very proud to say a friend of mine was on, but there were only 5 people on it, which just goes to show, where we've come. And when I think about the progress that's been made over the years, we've gone uh, from it being illegal. And, I grew up where 21 was the age of consent. It's now equal. Marriage is equal. It is just remarkable. So that is fantastic. But I think it is important to continue to celebrate a community, but equally to remind ourselves that for so many around the world, life isn't that great for them because, in some countries, it is punishable by death. So it is, I think, important to remind ourselves that, we're not just sort of trying to improve equality for us in this country, but also for those around the world.
I think it's interesting that at the World Cup, they have that pride game between, I think, two countries that are where homosexuality is currently illegal.
Yeah.
I wonder what it was like for you, if you're happy to talk about it, coming out.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it was a challenge because, as you might expect, growing up in Anglesey back in the sort of 70s, 80s, it was a challenge being gay anywhere in the country then, but being in sort of darkest, deepest Wales, if you like, it was scary. I knew that there was something different about me, and I couldn't tell anybody for years. It was. Whilst I was at school, I certainly couldn't. I eventually told one of my friends when I was 17. Excuse me. She was very, very supportive, but it took me a while to eventually tell my mum. But I'm so lucky because she was just absolutely brilliant about it. It didn't even matter in her mind. I was her son, and that was the end of it. Took me a bit longer to tell dad. In the event, my mum, told him, but he wrote me the most beautiful letter to sort of say, it doesn't matter, you're my son. That's what I'm proud of, and I've been wonderfully supported by my brothers as well. So I've had it really easy compared to so many people who sadly don't haven't had it as easy. Um, I've gone through various experiences that have not been particularly pleasant, but what mattered to me most was my friends and my family, and I'm blessed that all of them have just been phenomenally wonderful.
You talked about that sort of response and maybe some of the things that have gone through that have been unpleasant.
Mm.
I just wondered, do you think that's something that's becoming less in the modern world?
Well, I'd like to think so. I mean, I think there are some that are trying to. There are some people who are reporting that crime is going, hate, anti-gay crime is going up. Now, I don't know whether that is because more people feel confident in reporting it, and so therefore it would naturally go up, or whether there is a rise, uh, in that. I can only say what I experience day to day, and I feel like we live in a totally different world to the one that, when I was that scared sort of teenager. It feels amazingly, people don't bat an eyelid really. They're sort of, just see me as me, which is wonderful. But, from having gone through a period where I got beaten up so badly I was knocked unconscious because I'm gay, to now living, and representing a constituency and no one really mentioning it or giving a damn about it, I think is incredible, really.
Not about being gay specifically, but I wonder if there's anything sort of personally that motivates you and the sort of I guess personal experiences have helped you within the sort of political field.
I think it is genuinely, the best feeling in the world is when a constituent comes to me for help. Usually, you can almost see the exhaustion on their face. They've been battling with whatever it may be, and whatever government agency or other agency that they've been working with. And they look exhausted and they're at the end of their tether. And if you're able to resolve that problem for them, there is no greater feeling, to see the relief on their faces is phenomenal, and that gives me a tremendous amount of personal satisfaction, and one of the main reasons why I do the job. Because I just like to think that if someone is struggling, someone is in difficulty, and needs help, that I'm able to do that for them. Sadly, that's not always the case. Sometimes you fail, but it's not for the want of trying. And I think so long as you demonstrate that you've tried your best, then I think people appreciate that. But yeah, that for me, I think is the best part of the job.
You have been doing it for 16 years now, so I guess you're a sort of a older teenager MP wise. I wonder what keeps you motivated and keeps you going.
I think it is that continual general interest in policy. I find the whole thing fascinating. And, in the 16 years I've been there, my God, a lot's happened. We've gone through all sorts of things, like post financial crash to the EU referendum to, COVID, sadly, things like the war in Ukraine. So there's a hell of a lot has happened in that 16 years that I've been there. So that sort of certainly keeps you interested and motivated. But I do think it is, genuinely working with people and doing a lot of the constituency work. The thing that really is interesting, you can live in an area and think you know it well. But actually, when you become the member of parliament, so many of these places, whether they be businesses, charities, organizations, or whatever, invite you along to see their work. And you suddenly realize that there's some amazing things happening on your doorstep that you knew nothing about, even though you've lived there, for however long. And that for me, I find, really fascinating. Literally every single day is a school day because I'm learning more.
You are, of course, the MP for Daventry. I wonder, anyone listening, anyone, maybe if it turns into a video clip, um, what would you do to recommend? What would you recommend people to come to Daventry to do?
Oh my goodness. There's so much to think about here. I mean, obviously, we're not a million miles away from Silverstone. So there's a lot about the sort of whole, racing industry that is really interesting here. We've got companies like Mercedes that, are investing God knows how much money in the sort of, improving performance of their racing cars and stuff that they do. But then you've got these beautiful villages and towns and villages around Daventry itself that are just stunning. I mean, a lot of people call the area, it's a bit like the Cotswolds, but without the tourists, So you've got this beautiful countryside, some historic buildings. We've got the Battle of Naseby on our doorstep, which is the sort of birthplace, if you like, of modern politics and parliamentary world that we now know so well today, but also just a thriving network of community organizations that are doing phenomenal work. It really is it's a lovely part of the world. The people are incredibly friendly. It is well worth a visit because it's absolutely stunning. And living here, it is convenient to get anywhere. It's unbelievably easy. London's an hour away. The north of England is a bit further, perhaps an hour and a half away. So everything's on your doorstep. It feels like.
As we come to the end of this podcast interview, I wondered if you could give yourself advice for when you were younger, what that might be.
It would be have a bit more faith in yourself, and never ever give up because it will happen in the end.
Amazing. I like to end with a fun game that I tried out for the
Okay.
first time in the last podcast. And you might hate this, but we'll find out. It's Prime Minister winner stays on. So we're going to compete former prime ministers against each other. And I would like you to pick which one you would choose over the other, if you'd be willing to do so.
Oh, great. So this will make me very popular with some of them and very. Okay, go on then.
It's probably an easy start. We'll start, obviously, not the prime minister at the moment, but I assume you would like her to become the prime minister. So if we start with Kemi Badenoch against the current prime minister, Sir Keir Starmer,
Oh, hands down, Kemi.
Kemi Badenoch or Rishi Sunak.
Oh, this is going to be really difficult because I've got to be loyal to Kemi all the way through here. Actually, I think Kemi is doing a phenomenal job, so I'm going to say Kemi.
To be frank, there's a lot of conservative prime ministers as well to go through. So Kemi Badenoch or Liz Truss,
Oh, Kemi.
Kemi Badenoch or Boris Johnson.
Well, that's a hard one because he's just connected so well with the public. Although she's doing, so I'm going to say Kemi again, actually, because I think yeah,
I wonder if she'll win all the rounds. Kemi Badenoch or Theresa May.
Kemi.
Kemi Badenoch or David Cameron.
Kemi.
Kemi Badenoch or Tony Blair.
Yeah, Kemi, obviously.
Kemi Badenoch or John Major.
Do you know what? The problem with that one is that John Major is, his background really inspires me because, Brixton lad and all that. But I'm going to go Kemi again just because, yeah.
Tricky for some. Kemi Badenoch or Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, well, I'm afraid, sorry, Kemi, but I'm going to go Margaret Thatcher now. She's the one that got me into politics.
Margaret Thatcher or Edward Heath.
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher or Harold Macmillan.
Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher or Clement Attlee.
Thatcher.
And we'll end with this one. Margaret Thatcher or Winston Churchill.
It's got to be Winston Churchill. I mean, the Second World War could have annihilated our country. He got us through that. He deserves it.
Fantastic. Stuart Andrew, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. Been really enjoyable.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Personality Politics podcast. A huge thank you to Stuart Andrew MP for taking the time to share his story so openly. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. I've been Tom Lane, and I'll see you next time for another conversation on the Personality Politics Podcast.